What's up, everybody? Charlie Potter, senior team writer with BamaOnLine here, and got another game to kind of recap and another one to look forward to. So, Alabama's coming off of a 42-16 win over South Florida. Kind of an ugly game early on. I think we would all agree, kind of reminiscent of last year outside of the rain. But we're going to kind of put our share our final thoughts on this one, kind of put it to bed and look ahead to Wisconsin. Um, so I'll start with you, Jimmy. I know you've talked about it with Tim after the game and earlier this week. Just what was your biggest maybe takeaway from the game, and maybe the biggest area improvement that you think Alabama needs to clean up going into week 3?
Yeah, definitely. Both are related in the sense that, this game was a lot closer than a lot of Alabama fans anticipated or wanted. And why was that the case? Well, the two biggest reasons were the turnovers and the penalties. If Alabama had not turned over the ball 3 times, if Alabama hadn't committed all those penalties and taken those big plays off the board, because that was the weird. It's not just that you had 13 penalties for over 100 yards. That's bad enough, but you were taking multiple big chunk plays off the board with so many of those penalty calls. If you take away the turnovers and the penalties, this game got sort of ugly score-wise. It would have. But you can't take away the turnovers. You can't take away the penalties. The game played out like it did. But to me, the turnovers and penalties were the biggest story in the game for Alabama. It's why the game was close for basically 54, 55 minutes. And it's the number one thing that has to be cleaned up. Now, what can you do to clean it up? Alabama's been a penalized football team for a couple of years. It's not new that Alabama would have a double-digit penalty game based on 2021, 22, and last year. So there just has to be concerted effort. Don't turn the ball over, commit fewer penalties. But just the way they're playing offense and defense has actually been, I think, largely impressive. And if they just play a clean game, I really like Alabama's chances in Madison this weekend.
Yeah, discipline's a big thing that comes to mind when you talk about both of those things. And it's going to be important on the road, first road game, especially for an offense that struggled in terms of just the cleanliness of the game. It's going to be a raucous environment up there in Madison at Camp Randall Stadium. And if you're committing those penalties, now there were a few that were pre-snap, majority of them were holding penalties. So that's a little bit of a silver lining there. But if you're committing penalties and turning the football over, it's tough to win anywhere, but especially on the road. So yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of priority number one. So for you, Blake, I know this is kind of tough coming off that. Is there anything else that you think that Alabama needs to clean up, or maybe the biggest area improvement for this team going into this third game?
Yeah, I think area of improvement wise, really, you just have to look at the health of the offensive line. And I think that was probably maybe the biggest issue whenever you look at this South Florida game. And it kind of makes it almost hard to figure out what you can take away because of how much things were shuffled up front. And you look at the guys that started in the on the offensive line in the South Florida game, almost two and maybe two and a half of like your actual starting five, because Kadyn Proctor was out. So then you had to kick Tyler Booker, the left guard, out to left tackle, which left a backup in Geno Vandemark at left guard. You have your starting center and your starting right guard and Parker Brailsford, Jaden Roberts. But then out at right tackle, Wilkin Formby played, but kind of this whole season we've been wanting to see a right tackle competition between Wilkin Formby and Elijah Pritchett, though because of injuries to Proctor and even in this game, an injury to Pritchett, which kept him out for the first 3.5 quarters, you haven't really gotten to see that competition. So while Formby has started the first 2 games, we don't know if he's for sure the starter at that right tackle spot going forward. We don't know if Pritchett is going to take over that spot after his really strong fourth quarter performance that he had against South Florida. And so because of all of the shuffling up front, you had a lot of difficulties communicating when it came to facing a bunch of unique pressure and blitz packages that South Florida brought. And that brought a lot of pressure, which made it hard to run the offense effectively, on top of all the penalties that came with some of those guys that were being inserted into the lineup, like Geno Vandemark, for example, not a typical starter, but he had 3 holding or 3 penalties. I think 2 of them were holding calls. And then Formby, not knowing for sure if he's going to continue starting moving forward, he had 3 holding calls. And so you have all these penalties and miscommunications with handling pressure from the offensive line up front. And that makes it kind of hard to figure out what you can take away, because we don't really know what we've seen as far as Alabama with a healthy offensive line running the offense with those first 5 up front.
Yeah, I think availability of the offensive line is kind of the root cause of a lot of issues. We've heard from Kalen DeBoer, Nick Sheridan, Coach Cap, anybody really on the offensive side of the ball, and they talk about the importance of the offensive line. I think anyone that follows football knows that if you have solid play up front, you're going to have success more often than not on the offensive side of the ball. And when things are out of sync, that's going to affect things. It's going to affect your quarterback. It's going to affect your run game. So yeah, I think with Elijah Pritchett, that's kind of something we hinted at a little bit last week. We touched on the BOL roundtable before the game, just that being a possibility because with the way that Alabama won the first game of the season, Elijah getting hurt was kind of overlooked a little bit. And then I think they were just being as cautious as possible and getting him reps late while maybe a head scratcher, people wondering, why wasn't this the case sooner? I think it showed that they have, confidence in him and want to get him ready to roll this week. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think the offensive line, yeah, the way that they played is because a lot of things were just different. That's a group that has to be in sync, has to gel. And while I think communication wasn't necessarily an issue, and it usually isn't at home, it's just something that obviously impacted the offense. And then I think another thing that you have to clean up, kind of putting a bow on this, is for the defensive side of the ball. I thought overall the defense played pretty good against an offense that has a slippery quarterback back there that can make a lot of plays in a lot of ways. But the explosive plays on the ground, I think, are maybe a concern just because you have so much experience along that defensive line, add in that linebacker and at safety that you don't want to see that. I think they had 9 plays of 11 or more yards. South Florida piled up 200 plus on the ground against Alabama, and that's never ideal. And I know that's something that Kane Womack wasn't pleased with. So, cleaning that up, going against a Big Ten team this week, I think is going to be important. And I think if they can do all these things, if they get some guys back on the offensive line, if they cut down on the turnovers and penalties, and they stop the run, I think this game at Wisconsin can be a successful one for Alabama. And we'll kind of stick with the offensive line here a little bit. I'll go to you, Jimmy. We've heard from Kalen DeBoer just in terms of what he said Monday and then on the SEC teleconference. To be transparent here, we're recording this before the coaches show, the radio show, so he might give another update, but they haven't had another practice, so it probably won't be much different. But hearing the positive reaction he's had to what Kadyn Proctor has been able to do in practice, what Elijah Pritchett has been able to do, just kind of what are your expectations for this offensive line and what we'll probably see on Saturday?
Yeah, I know what Alabama fans would like to see seems to line up with what Coach DeBoer's been saying. I think Alabama fans would like to see Kadyn Proctor out making his first start against Wisconsin and not Georgia.
Right.
So that would be a positive. And I think at right tackle, after what happened with Wilkin Formby's struggle game last week, I think the fans would like to see Elijah Pritchett get a shot at right tackle and start. That's what the fans want to see. It's kind of what I expect to see based on DeBoer's comments is Proctor on the left side and Pritchett on the right side. But what I want to say is if it's not that way, if it is Wilkin Formby out there, I just would predict or foresee. I don't think you would see the same performance from Wilkin. I think it's a completely different opponent. I think it's a different mindset. He's had a week to go over tape. He's had a week to be coached. Every freshman's going to have a game like that, regardless of what position you play. I think it's more famously seen with quarterbacks. But, hey, once you're a young player and things start rolling downhill on you, it's kind of hard to get it back, panic a little. Again, we see it at quarterback, but it really happens at all 22 positions. And I think we would see a better Formby if we saw him this week against Wisconsin. But I predict that it's going to be Proctor on the left side and Pritchett on the right side, which is what the fans, I think, would like to see. The good news in all of it, if you ask me, the best news is Tyler Booker back as left guard spot where, frankly, he's one of the more dominant offensive linemen in the sport.
Yeah, Coach Cap was really he just really heaped on the praise for Tyler Booker when we talked to him after practice on Wednesday. And I think he did a solid job at left tackle. He talked about how different it was, but he welcomes those challenges. And I think you're right. When you hear about what Kalen DeBoer said, I would kind of be shocked if Kadyn Proctor's not out there this week. We heard and we talked about it on the roundtable that if it was absolutely necessary, you don't want to kind of undermine the opponent because obviously South Florida's given Alabama some trouble. But if it was absolutely necessary, I think Kadyn Proctor could have probably given it a go last week. And, seeing what Alabama put out from a photo and video standpoint this week, I know we had an eagle eye poster, I believe it was AY Wilson 19. Spotted Kadyn Proctor in the background of Tuesday's video, getting reps beside Tyler Booker with the one. So kudos to that. But it's kind of lines up with what we've been hearing from Kalen DeBoer. I think for me, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Blake, what's going to be fascinating is what happens at right tackle, because Pritchett came in, he was fired up. He played six snaps, and that led to 21 points in the final 6 minutes. It helps that he's fresh coming in against a South Florida defensive front that's played the entire game, but I still think it's encouraging. And he was obviously fired up. I think he's healthy after what I think was an ankle injury in week 2. So what do you foresee on that right side of the line, and what could maybe rotation mean for Alabama if that is to continue?
Yeah, I think based on what we've heard from a lot of different coaches, with not just Coach Cap, but in a lot of different position groups, is that they're what they do in practice is important, but when you're talking about position battles, they've heavily emphasized wanting to see what these guys do in a game. And from what we've seen, and specifically what we saw from Elijah Pritchett in the last couple minutes of the fourth quarter against South Florida, I think that's going to matter a whole lot. And because of that play, I think you're going to see him get a start on Saturday. This is as long as Kadyn Proctor's healthy on the left side. But assuming that Proctor plays at left tackle, I think we could see Elijah Pritchett get the start at right tackle. But I also don't think at all that's going to mean that he's going to play the entire game there. I think since week 1, really since before the season started, Coach Cap has told us how he wants there to be a rotating right tackle spot to kind of see who plays better at that position going forward in a game. And so we haven't really gotten to see the two guys rotate and gotten to see the other 4 set starting offensive linemen and see how each guy does in that unit. So because of injuries, we haven't gotten to see that. So I would expect to see both tackles. And just because Wilkin Formby had a rough night against South Florida doesn't mean he's never going to play a snap for Alabama again. It doesn't mean he's never going to start again. It doesn't mean he's already in the transfer portal like some people have overreacted and insinuated that it's going to happen. He's still a redshirt freshman, and that was his second ever career start. Like, he is a young player who's he was a pretty highly rated recruit. He's got talent. He's got the ability. The coaching staff clearly believes in him. And so we can't just go ahead and write him off because he had 3 holding calls in a week 2 game, his redshirt freshman season. Like, that's not going to end his career. But because of the way Pritchett played, I think that kind of made a lot of it popped to a lot of people. And I think because of that, we could see him get the start. But again, he won't be the only right tackle that plays. You'll see Wilkin Formby, and I think they would want to have this right tackle position kind of shored up going into Georgia. And maybe that's the case, maybe it's not, but I'm sure that's what they would like to, going against one of the best defensive fronts in all of college football. So you'll see this rotation, I would expect, on Saturday for them to kind of make a decision going forward about what to do with the ultimate starter at that spot.
No doubt. I'm glad you said that about Wilkin, because, yes, he had a bad game. Well, I'll say most of the holding calls were warranted. There were some, when you go back and watch the film, that were kind of a little ticky-tacky. But, yeah, I think he'll continue to get a shot. I do think they want to see that rotation like you talked about, because it hasn't come to fruition yet because of Kadyn Proctor's availability. And, again, I think that every sign kind of points to Kadyn being back this week. He's practicing. Kalen DeBoer said as much. And he said he kind of turned the corner last week or the end of last week, and he's looking good right now. So I think it's really positive, and good for Kadyn Proctor. He gets to finally get that Big Ten experience that maybe he was expecting back in January. But we'll kind of switch gears a little bit here, and we're going to talk about some bold predictions for this Wisconsin game, because I think this is a game some people are excited about. I think people are kind of maybe anxious about. And I'll start us off here just because I wrote down numbers. And when I write down numbers, I don't want you guys to take them. So my bold prediction kind of coincides also, though, with what we've been talking about up front. I think it's going to be a big day on the ground for Alabama. Wisconsin, the first 2 weeks, they played Western Michigan and South Dakota. They've given up 100 yards each in those games. They're averaging, defensively at least, allowing over 120 yards a game. They've got 3 touchdowns given up in the first 2 weeks against very inferior competition. And I just think with kind of the stars aligning for that offensive line, and then with Jam Miller and Justice Haynes in the backfield, I think that could be a big game on the ground this weekend. And I also think you add in Jalen Milroe's legs, and I wouldn't be surprised if Alabama gets over 200 yards on the ground against Wisconsin, and it's a little surprising because the Big Ten is kind of known for its play in the trenches, just the toughness and tenacity. But I think Alabama matches up well here, just in terms of what it can do up front with the size of its offensive line and just the way that these running backs have played through the first 2 games of the season. You look at it, and Justice and Jam are pretty fresh, all things considered. They have 36 combined carries, and they're right at what is that, 300 plus yards, nearly 4. So I think it's a game that they could really flex their muscles a little bit and have big production from both of those backs, and hell, maybe even Richard Young gets some of that too. So hopefully I didn't steal anything you guys were going to say. I'll give Jimmy the floor next to share his bold prediction.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily steal it, but I couldn't be more on the same page. Looking at Wisconsin's numbers, I think they haven't been shredded on the ground, but look who they were playing. I mean, they played Western Michigan and then South Dakota, but they've given up some substantial rushing yards considering the competition. And now here comes Alabama. I think 2 or 3 things line up for Alabama to want to run the ball here. Number one, the offensive line. Mm-hmm. Number two, in my experience, I think coaches, when they go on the road, you can't help but get a little more conservative. You don't really want to open things up. The easiest thing to do is run the ball. Alabama should have a lot of success doing that. So between the way Wisconsin's been a little soft on that side, Alabama's offensive line, and the run game success so far, I think it's a big game on the ground. To be specific, I'll go Justice Haynes having a career high and season high rushing. I like Justice Haynes with a minimum of 160 yards in this game, which is a pretty massive game for one back. But, Jam had 140 last week. I like Justice over 160 this weekend.
I like that. Justice having a big game before facing his home state Bulldogs. I like that a lot. What about you, Blake?
I thought about the run game going into this because another thing I didn't mention with the offensive line last game is that not having Tyler Booker inside, I think, affected Alabama's ability to run between the tackles, and that affected their offense in a very negative way in the first half. But I'm going to go to the defensive side. I don't think – here's the thing. I don't think Tyler Van Dyke can push the ball downfield against Alabama. And we know that these corners are young, and we know that these corners got beat a couple times against South Florida. So we could see Wisconsin see those couple of burned plays for these Alabama DBs against South Florida and think maybe we can try to push it over the top, even though that's not necessarily their style. But ultimately, I think Alabama's defensive line, the defensive front, is going to have success against Wisconsin and limit the run game, especially coming off of a game where Kane Womack was quite upset about the number of rushing yards allowed, the rushing touchdown in the red zone, all of those things. So I think you see a really good game out of the defensive line, which is going to force Wisconsin into some third and longs. And because of that, the bold prediction I'm going with is 2 interceptions from cornerbacks. Because we haven't seen an interception from a corner yet this season. Both the ones in the Western Kentucky game were from Keon Sabb, which is a safety back on the back end. And Kane Womack has also been kind of pushing and harping on the fact that Alabama needs to create more takeaways. So I think Alabama pushes Wisconsin into more third and long, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10, kind of forces Tyler Van Dyke to push some throws, maybe some places he shouldn't. Maybe Damani Jackson, maybe somebody else, Xavier Brown, whoever it is. But I think Alabama corners end up with 2 interceptions by the end of this game.
Yeah, that was my follow-up question is who do you think picks off those passes? You said Damani, and I think
Damani has one of them for sure. And then the other, I don't know how they're going to rotate the corners. It kind of depends on who's in the game. It could be Xavier Brown. It could be Mbakwe. It could be Deshaun Jones. We don't really know. We even talked to Mo Linguist today, and he was talking about how they want to kind of continue to build that depth. They're not just throwing 2 guys out there being Jackson and Brown and letting them go at it. They want to continue to build the depth. They know they have a long season. They know they're going to need that experience for all those younger guys. So Damani Jackson with one of them, and then one of the other ones gets the other one.
I want to kind of go to you on this, Jimmy, because we still saw a rotation at the cornerback spot in week 2, but it seemed like it was a little tighter just because you look at the snap counts and Alabama's defense, at least the first team defense, was on the field for I think 79 snaps, and Damani Jackson was out there for 66 of those. Xavier Brown was right behind him at 59. So those two played majority of the reps, but we still saw Jalen Mbakwe and now that he's a little healthier, Deshaun Jones. Just what did you think about that from a personnel standpoint, and what do you think about them going on the road, some of these young guys in this first opportunity?
Yeah, it gets back to what I just said. I think you get a little more conservative in this situation. To me, that means playing fewer players. And we've been talking about that since week 1 because they played so many guys against Western Kentucky. Fewer guys against South Florida makes sense. The game was tight. A name you didn't mention, Charlie at corner, Zay Mincy, played a handful of snaps in that first game. Didn't play at all against in week 2 against South Florida. I don't suspect we'll see Zay again this weekend. It'll just be the other 4. And I think they get even more conservative. By that, it means more of what they perceive as their top guys. That's clearly Damani and Zabian. I do think, in terms of, it's a little more prediction than anything. I think the riser here is Mbakwe. I mean, to me, he's been very impressive in the games. I think he's about to play a bigger role in the punt return game. I think Mbakwe over the course of the season could eat into Zabian Brown snaps to some extent. But I think at this point in the season, and particularly Jalen Mbakwe working on those punt returns being a real significant part of the game plan this weekend, I think it'll be not exclusively Damani and Zabian, but once again, mostly Damani and Zabian, Deshaun Jones working in, Mbakwe as a punt returner. This position might look a little different in November, but that's what it looks like today.
Yeah, I think having Jones back, that's why you see no Zay Mincy. He played a little on special teams, but his roles obviously it's clear he's the 5th corner, and they're sticking with 4. I'll be interested though. Like I'm not predicting he has any kind of mistakes, but just if Wisconsin watched the film and saw that some of these young defensive backs maybe they take a deep shot, like Blake was referring to earlier, is that something that if Zabian Brown gets into kind of prickly situation, do they lean on the veteran in Deshaun Jones? That's something that I think going on the road will be fascinating to see plays out, because I think if Zabian holds his ground, I mean, it's clear that he's a dude out there on the boundary. So I think that's going to be fascinating to see play out. And something that I kind of want to touch on, kind of ending this conversation, is just the wide receiver position, because I think if the offensive line is back to a more of what they expected for game 1, just in terms of personnel, that Jalen Milroe is going to have more time to throw. We've seen some big plays from these wide receivers, but what are you guys expecting from the passing game? Because we heard from Coach Shep today, and he talked about running through a dude's face in terms of just the physicality and the approach they want to have going on the road. So, Blake, I'll start with you just from a passing game standpoint. We talked a lot about the O-line and the backs already, but what do you kind of foresee through the air at Wisconsin?
Yeah, one thing I expect to see, and it's something fans have kind of been clamoring for since this South Florida game, with all of the pressure that Jalen Milroe faced, they've wanted to see some kind of short, quick plays to get playmakers the ball in space. And I feel like that's something that I'm sure Kalen DeVore has and Nick Sheridan has in their playbook and their arsenal, and something that they want to utilize. But putting maybe those pre-snap motions, those formations, those kind of plays on film against Western Kentucky and South Florida might not have been the route they wanted to go, kind of like Jimmy was mentioning earlier, with the amount of playbook that has been opened up. And I think we start to see some of that in this game with guys like Kendrick Law, who has surprisingly only 1 touch the entire season, and it was a touchdown. So I think you could see some things like that, maybe some end arounds, jet sweeps, but also just like maybe quick passes out to the sideline, screens, different types of things like that, to get Jalen Milroe in a rhythm to where whenever you want to dial up a deep shot to Ryan Williams or dial up a deep shot to whoever it is, his arm's a little more warm, and he's not just throwing it out with a cannon on the second, third pass of the game whenever he's not really in a rhythm yet. And so I expect to see a little more of that kind of dink and dunk kind of action, and getting playmakers like Kendrick Law, like Ryan Williams, like Jeremy Bernard, Kobe Prentice, whoever, the ball in space. Because let's be honest, Alabama is more athletic and faster than most of the guys on this Wisconsin team. If you're looking strictly from an athletic standpoint, South Florida might be a more athletic team than a lot of these guys Wisconsin has up there. So if Alabama can get the ball out in space, they're going to be able to make guys miss, and they're going to be able to make some big plays. So that's what I'm expecting out of the passing game.
I think this offense, it's safe to say it's probably in chapter 1, just in terms of the book that's been open. Heck, it might be the prologue phase. Like we might have not even gotten to the introduction yet. But Jimmy, what are you expecting offensively, at least from the passing game? We've seen some big plays from Ryan Williams. We saw Jeremy Bernard last week get more involved. I know that's something you predicted. Do you think it'll be not necessarily more wide open than what we've seen the first 2 weeks, but I guess just what are you expecting from the passing game in this game?
Yeah, and keep them with that idea that, hey, a conservative, by conservative, I just mean they're not going to go crazy. They're not going to, hey, let's spread it out. Let's chunk it 45 times. I think it's completely the opposite. And I think at wide receiver, and in terms of who they want to target, what they want to do, I think it's going to get back to what they really trust here, or what they really feel can produce. And to me, through 2 weeks, that's been Ryan Williams and to some extent Jeremy Bernard. I think this will be a game where there's a concerted effort to get Ryan a certain amount of touches. They trust him. He's played in 2 games. They trust that he's a playmaker. This is the first game they go into where they going into the game, they're like, hey, we're going to have to kind of unload the quiver of arrows here because we're on the road. It's a tough environment. Let's make plays with what we know we can do. And to me, that's Ryan through 2 games. I suspect Ryan will see the most targets and the most receptions he's seen. Now, that's a small sample size. It's only been 2 games. I don't know if I'd put a number on it, but I would say as many as maybe 8 targets. And with Ryan, that could be as many as 6 or 7 catches, as good as he is. But I'm expecting a lot of energy with Ryan, and hey, let's get the ball to Ryan. Let's make him make plays and get out of here because this game makes us a little nervous.
Yeah, I mean, he has made plays. He has 3 receiving plays of 40-plus yards. That's tied for the national lead, and all 3 of those have been touchdowns. So when they get him the ball, good things happen. And we'll get out of here on this. You know, we're going up to Wisconsin to see something new, something different. The jump around tradition in the third quarter, I think, is something that's going to be a lot of fun to see in person. So we'll hold off on that since that's coming this weekend. I wanted to ask you guys, what are some other college football traditions that maybe you want to see in person that you haven't seen? So Blake, we'll start up there with you, man.
You know, we were talking about this earlier today, and I've been thinking about it, and I'm not going to steal your answer.
You better not. I thought that you were going to.
I'm not going to steal it. But one thing I do really want to see is Ralphie's run at Colorado. I love live animal mascots. I think they're so cool, and I think it's really cool when you have, and like dogs are cool and whatever, but like when you have animals that like notably should not be on a football sideline, like a buffalo. I just think that's awesome. And also, like, you go to Texas and they have like a longhorn on the sideline. Like, I think things like that are so cool. But Ralphie's run, you have a giant buffalo running across the football field. I mean, what more can you love? Like, that's just great. I'd love to see that at some point. The one you're going to say I really like, and then there's some others like Oklahoma, which we'll get to see later this year. That's very cool. We'll get to see Florida State early next year. So there's a ton of great college football traditions. But I'd go with Colorado and Ralphie's run.
Yeah, Jimmy, we haven't talked about this, so you might steal mine, and that's fine. But what about you?
It won't be on purpose. I have a serious answer and a silly answer. My serious answer, which kind of surprised myself when I gave it a lot of thought, but my serious answer is Army-Navy, which I know isn't a huge game, but it's so historical. Mm-hmm. The pageantry, just the sailors and the soldiers entering the stadium. I think there's just so much history with that, so much patriotism. It's a can't miss thing for me every year. And of course, I haven't seen it in person. So my serious answer is just attending an Army-Navy game and all the traditions that go along with it, because I don't think anything harkens back to the history of college football right now like Army-Navy. And my silly answer is at some point, I'm going to go to that yell practice thing because I've seen it on video and I don't really believe it happens. It looks more like an SNL skit to me, but it might be real. So I'm going to go. I want to see it to believe it. And on the one hand, I think it's kind of crazy. On the other hand, I think it's really cool because it's neat that each school has its own set of traditions and it's not the same thing. And I'm really jealous of you guys or anybody gets to see the jump around thing at Wisconsin this weekend because that's college football. That's what you don't get in the NFL. And as much as the game itself is awesome, the traditions of college football are incredible. So the A&M thing I would actually like to see, even though like a lot of their rivals, I sort of make fun of it, but I do want to see it.
I saw that as a student the first time Alabama went out there to face A&M when they joined the league, and it's different. I'll say that. I don't want to spoil it for you. It's different. Yeah, and I'll say this. This wasn't to give you FOMO, Jimmy. It just seemed like it was a topical thing to bring up. So we're not. That's why we're not rubbing in, jump around. But for me, I'm glad nobody said it. And this honestly, if we all make it this far, Alabama's supposed to go to Virginia Tech in 2034, and the Inner Sandman entrance just seems so badass. I think that would be a lot of fun. And like for jump around, it's like third quarter. I think when the third quarter ends is when it starts. So that's a lot like Dixieland Delight or Colin Baton Rouge at LSU. So that's pretty cool. But another one for me that I think would be cool to see. It's not so much of a hype you up moment, but the wave that they do at Iowa to the Children's Hospital, that would also be something neat to see in person. And yeah, Blake and I will be up in Wisconsin this weekend to watch it, to cover it. We'll have a ton of content. I know we've had a ton this week. All three of us have done a solid job previewing this game. But
can you jump around in the press box? I know you can't cheer, but can you jump around?
Well,
I wonder if it shakes.
That's the thing about A&M is like they put a flyer at your seat and they warn you that the press box will sway when they start to do their chants that they practice on Friday
night. Does.
So yeah. And well, before they renovated Kyle Field, it really shook it. The press box would kind of pop a little bit, and it was very nerve-wracking. So I imagine we might not bounce by our own volition. It might be, the stadium's bouncing, so we're kind of forced to. But I don't know. I'll have to ask around. I didn't ask the Wisconsin writer I reached out to this week for our Behind Enemy Lines segment about that. So TBD. We'll keep you posted. But yeah, all of us will keep all you guys posted on Alabama, Wisconsin this weekend. If you guys are tuning in on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. It definitely helps us out. And looking forward to it this weekend, fellas. It's going to be a good weekend of college football, not just in Madison, but around the country. We'll have those predictions up on the site. I think Friday night, since it's a morning kick, we'll do that. But plenty more to come at BOL. So stay tuned. And thanks a lot for tuning in, everyone.